If I asked you to get a piece of paper and something to write with, and to make a numerical list of all the things that you would be willing to die for, how long is your list?
Panther 48.
Willing to die for.
Panther 48.
Willing to die for. How long is your list?
What is the tribal self?
Panther
The
48.
tribal self is what goes above the immediate acquaintances of the social.
Willing to die
The
for.
family, the people you know, live next door.
You would be willing
I'm
to
talking
die
about
for.
tribal self.
Panther 48.
I'm talking about those movies, those yet unborn, and those who are the
How
ancestors.
long is your list?
So the connection with the ancestors is tied into the tribal self.
Panther 48.
What does that mean? That means that the tribal self constantly reminds us
Willing to die for.
that we don't have the
How
right
long is your
to
list?
claim independence.
Panther 48.
People, everyone, let's go ahead and get started here. Let me share my screen and we dig into this. Just have someone acknowledge that they can't see the screen.
Yeah, comrade, I can see it.
Got it. Appreciate it. All right. Well, today, before I even jump into talking about what we got going on, the war of false purpose and the liabilities of human nature. Today class is a little bit different because what we kind of doing is taking a step back from the direct aspect of politics, but at the same time, we're dealing with how we end up wrapped into the political struggle, or we end up wrapped into the struggle period as it applies to what happens with the masses and how we end up defining ourselves. Now, what's important about this is within the Panther movements, we have what we refer to as our 3Ds, which is define, develop, and defend. Too often we find ourselves as a people not truly figuring out what it means to define something. So when you talk about whether it be an individual perspective or a collective perspective, definitions become truly and vastly important, because your definitions and how you view yourself according to the definitions in the world around you shape your perspective and your reality. So when we talk about dealing with the idea of a war on false purpose, it gets into the aspect of learning how to codify what has been defined for you within yourself and your reality, and how you tend to navigate that. So when you deal with a situation to where your definition, or should we say your character and who you see yourself to be, is not necessarily in line with where society, quote unquote, sees it to be, as well as what we call to be being productive, or the production of a society, then we find ourselves dealing with what we call the liabilities of human nature. So let's start off by just making this basic statement that everything that exists has a specific nature. Each entity exists, has something in particular, and it has characteristics that are part of what it is. The reason why it's important to start with that is because, and it kind of just seems obvious to most of us, should be anyway, that everything has a purpose. Everything has a place. The problem we find with that, especially as it applies to humans and human nature, is that we tend to operate outside of balance and harmony as it applies to everything else that exists that has a place within nature. We find that we tend to think of ourselves as being above nature, above everything, and not so much just the caretakers of the planet, but that the planet actually owes us. And the sense of entitlement as individuals and as collectives tend to cause us to go outside of the balance in which nature has, to the point to where our sustainability impedes the natural cycle of life. And as we get older and we address that as it applies to purpose, then we get caught up in a situation to where we'll talk about this a little later on, we deal with what we call the point of no return. And this is where you start crossing into where logic will take a backseat for the sake of just how things are. And then we'll start rationalizing behavior patterns. We'll start rationalizing all of the repercussions of everything that goes on in life, which then tends to find ourselves needing to be able to do what? Go back in a state of repair. And so from that standpoint, let's go into what's called high moral code. And we deal with this because it was within our Panther platform, there's a statement that addresses that, and then we'll talk about that. So let's first talk about what is high moral code. A moral code is a set of rules that are widely accepted by a group of people to show them what is right and what's wrong. Now, what we got to keep in mind here when we say it's a group of people of what's right and what's wrong, as we get on into the discussion here, well, who defines what's right and what's wrong? Who determines that? Who tells you that? How is that applied across the board? So then when you say a moral code can help a person know that they are how they are expected to act in the society or their culture in order to live a safe life and navigate, I should say live a life and navigate and grow effectively. So we now have to break down the concept here of the term moral code collectively. Morality can help the people to assess if they are doing right or wrong by their actions or words, whereas a code is a set of rules or laws that dictate human behavior. Therefore, moral codes are a set of rules that show us how people should behave in an ethical manner. Now, by adding high to this statement, it means that a moral code have stood the test of time and are a basis of solid foundations. So let's stop right there real quick and build on that. So when we talk about high moral code, we're basically talking about the sets of again, what defines morality in terms of the way society has conducted itself, and then the codes in terms of really when you think about the rules in terms of how humanity dictates itself to operate. So the high aspect of that comes into play simply because what we're talking about is we're talking about things that across the board tend to be carbon copied regardless of a culture, regardless of a way of life. But it's like, for instance, to give a basic general example of that, when people think of the 10 commandments within religious doctrine, thou shalt not kill. From that standpoint, the justification for saying that has to do with basically the balance of or the necessity for life to exist for the sake of serving out its purpose. So the point is when you throw the morality aspect to that, now you have to define, well, when is it okay to kill? When is it okay to break the quote unquote code? And so from that standpoint, there's always a tug of war that's going on between morality and code. And humanity itself tends to find itself working against these two things as it applies oftentimes based upon how that society has developed, which brings us to entropy, which is a lack of order or predictability, gradual decline into disorder, a doctrine of inevitable social decline and degradation. See, the problem we have when we talk about dealing with false purpose is that as a society grows, as a society gets larger, as a society oftentimes becomes more of what's referred to as civilized or developed, and that increases with a population, you're going to have more people operating more in sync with the status quo, more in sync with whatever it takes to keep producing and consuming and growing, and that society and that civilization expanding, which goes in the concept of conquest and as well as colonialization. When we deal with that from that standpoint, there will be a natural decline or disorder that always follows that. The reason being this always follows that is because it really goes back to the concept of natural law. When things are built, they must be destroyed. Everything has a cycle in time. So when we deal with the false purpose aspect of this, it goes into the fact that society and the people that are operating within that society find themselves trapped within the various aspects of what does it mean for me to have a purpose. It's like the cliche that tends to trap us a lot. For instance, someone would say to you, and I don't mean to be picking on religion, so y'all just kind of bear with me. If someone says to you, you know, God has a plan for you, God has a purpose for you, that statement, that ambiguous statement, would kind of throw you for a loop when you try to apply it from a logical point of view, simply because why would whether we want to call it the creator, nature, whatever, not have a purpose or a plan for everything that exists within the ecosystem? The problem is because of our upbringing, because of our lack of connection with nature, our lack of connection with everything that is operating outside of the human sphere of existence, we tend to forget this. We tend to operate as if though as humans, we are above the concept of balance. We are above the concept of harmony. And so as we develop in our adult life and we start operating outside of those parameters, then something has to be pushed to gear us back toward some type of equilibrium. Does anybody got any questions before I keep moving on, or something to add on that? All right, let me keep on here. Hold on just a second. All right, and so now we want to talk about falsehood. Falsehood is the lack of conformity to truth or a fact, which again goes into entropy. I'm sorry, goes into entropy. So when you're dealing with entropy, there's a chain reaction that takes place. So we start off dealing with morality, code, entropy, falsehood, and now we have to define now what is purpose in order to have a better gauge of how all these things come to be. So dealing with purpose is to set as an aim, intention, or goal for oneself, the reason for which something exists or is done, made, used, etc. So when we talk about the definition and we talk about what purpose is and how do you create that purpose, well, how do you determine what is considered to be a false purpose versus a true purpose? And so from that standpoint, when you go into talking about set as an aim, intention, or goal for oneself, who defines that oneself? So as we move on, we want to actually get into that aspect of what that is. So the question is, so we must ask ourselves, what elements within my sphere of awareness or non-awareness created the aim of my purpose? So the key element here is that oftentimes we think about our sphere of awareness, but what we don't think about is the non-awareness, because it is the things that you recognize as well as the things that you don't recognize that are the quote unquote elements that create the aim. Because again, our place within society, our place within nature, our place within this planet, our place within just where we are on the block, where we are within any time space continuum, goes into whether or not we're able to recognize what purpose is. So let's start that off with just dealing with point number 1 on the 10-point platform. We say we are gaining freedom. We promote the power of practicing self-determination, determining the destiny of our communities, and defining the Black nation. We embrace the spiritual high moral code of our ancestors. And that's why I started us off talking about what is high moral code, because here we're basically saying we embrace the spiritually high moral code of our ancestors. And in engaging that, I underline this section here, we accept the accountability, because then when we talk about purpose, how can you talk about purpose and how can you talk about actually achieving anything or pursuing something for that matter without accepting the accountability of it? So we say here that we accept the accountability that Black people are free to collectively determine our divine destiny. Now, when we talk about being free to collectively determine divine destiny, again, we started off saying we're gaining freedom, and then we end up talking about free to collectively determine destiny. So when you talk about how a purpose is defined and the way a purpose is dealt with when you deal with society, or as well as when you deal with an individual, Well, what created that purpose? What created your drive? What created your movement? What created your actions? What created all of the steps that you take on a day-to-day level in living your life? So when you're talking about freedom, and then we can go into the aspect of liberation, well, what are you free from? What are you free to do? So in addressing that, let's talk about this here quote here from 50 Cent in the 50th Law. It's a few quotes I got from this because I think this is a very powerful book, especially as it applies to addressing this subject. When you work for others, you are at their mercy. They own your work. They own you. Your creative spirit is squashed. What keeps you in such position is a fear of having to sink or swim on your own. Instead, you should have a greater fear of what will happen if you remain dependent upon others for power. Your goal in every maneuver in life must be ownership, working within a corner for your life, for yourself. When it is yours to lose, you are more motivated, more creative, more alive. The ultimate power in life is to be completely self-reliant, completely yourself. And the reason why I wanted to throw that in there behind point number 1 of the 10-point platform is because it says here that we are practicing self-determination and determining the destiny. So when you talk about determining your destiny, then you have to hold yourself accountable. And in holding yourself accountable, that means that you have to be able to move past the gauges of fear. And so that's super important. So now we have to go into here when determining purpose, take into account the following conditions. And this goes into who we all of the different aspects of what makes you you. But number 1 here, what group of people do I look to for guidance? And why that's important in terms of what group of people I look to for guidance, because when you talk about a situation to where you are amongst those that you find important in regards to providing, going back to the moral code, providing examples of how to live your life, all of these things are going to shape the concept of what you come up with when you talk about a purpose. And then number 2 here, what group of people look to me for guidance? So when you talk about that, now you're talking about based upon what you have gained, learned, and operate from, there are a set of people always around you, or a set of people that you may be guiding for the same thing. Mind you, this is another element of that we tend to take for granted is by saying the concept of guidance. Oftentimes when we use the word guidance, we think that means that we are directly attempting to influence somebody, as if I'm going up to them and saying, hey, this is what you need to do, da 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 da. That ain't necessarily the case, because people emulate each other, especially in mass movement. So from that standpoint, oftentimes when you think you're not guiding someone, when you think you're not influencing someone, if they're monitoring you and that behavior it multiplies itself based upon a group of people doing the same thing, then in essence, those people are looking to you for guidance. And this goes into a concept called monkey mind. By that, what we mean is oftentimes when a whole society is operating, or a large portion of society is operating a certain way, that tends to be viewed as sanity, regardless of the fact that if a person from an individual level is able to step back and see what is happening collectively, the entire society of culture is built upon how the masses are operating and moving in this pattern. This is how it is easy to manipulate the masses to some degree, because from that standpoint, if you emulate what you constantly are exposed to, and because again, dealing with the aspect of freedom and dealing with the aspect of liberation, this is all you know based upon your perception that has been narrowed down for you to only know things a certain way. Now we talk about the root of how false purpose begins to take shape. And so from that standpoint, when you think that people are looking at you for guidance, as if you have reached out to people specifically and say, hey, watch what I do, or do what I do and follow me, and I'm going to lead you in this specific, right direction. That is not necessarily the case. Oftentimes we subconsciously operate and move on guidance, whether it be from others or from ourselves. So we have to be aware of that. Number three, how old am I physically and mentally? See, too often we associate our age with our physical characteristics, but what we're not doing is associating the mental capacity in operation of our age as well. When we are impacted by traumatic events, especially within our childhood, oftentimes we become stagnated in terms of our mental growth and our emotional growth. So they don't necessarily keep up in sync with our physical age. And so therefore, if my mental growth and emotional growth and psychological growth is damaged or impaired, then I'm not going to be operating on the same caliber or level as I would be from looking at things, viewing things from that physical level. And so with that being the case, that's obviously is going to impair or impact what purpose means to me. So how do I define family? Number four, based on how you define your family or what a family means is also going to create whether or not you have purpose. Or I'm sorry, whether or not you have a sense of false purpose or not. For instance, when we talk about going back to nature, in nature, everything that is a living organism is based upon a replication, reproduction. So therefore, humans, again, not recognizing in this sense of entitlement we have, when we have a child, we tend to think that that in itself is my purpose. Well, reproduction is meant for the continuation of the human race or the continuation of life, period. But is that in essence your purpose is to reproduce? So from that standpoint, when you talk about defining a family, well, what makes a family? When you go look at it from the position of reproduction, then you're going to basically say man, woman, child. Child develops a spouse, meets a spouse and then repeats that same process. But also, when we talk about family, when you look at it from that small sector, what is it that you live in terms of a community? What makes your family any different from the next family? And how do you bring those families together and connect those families? So too often when we think of family, we only think of the individual unit within a household, as opposed to looking at things from a collective level in terms of the family of humanity, so to speak. Because the more we isolate things down to its individualized level, this is going to affect the overall level in terms of how we treat ourselves in terms of balancing out humanity versus nature, so to speak. And so when you talk about defining your family, that's going to impair or improve what it means to you when you talk about dealing with purpose. Number five, how do I define community? Again, family and community must have a sense of connection. If there is not a connection between the two, then that will affect what it means to you when you talk about having purpose. How do I define me and self? This is where it starts really breaking down the aspect of you as an individual. Now that you dealt with family, now that you have a awareness of community, well, what does it mean to be what does it mean to talk about defining me or myself? Do we define ourselves by our career path? Do we define ourselves by our extracurricular activities? What do you call it? Do you define yourself based upon ethnic group? What are these different things that come together that cause you to define yourself? Because the less we are able to dig down and apply all of the different various things that go into the human body, whether we talk about physical, mental, spiritual, then the more narrow you are in terms of defining yourself and having awareness of self, the easier it is for you to operate without a true purpose. The easier it is for you to operate in somebody else's purpose, or to operate, in a sense of being controlled. Who am I trying to prove my purpose to? That's what's important, because when we talk about separating the difference between a false purpose and a true purpose, if you are attempting to prove your purpose to someone else, then that right there really breaks it down and makes it a moot point to think that you're not on the path of a false purpose. If you're proving your purpose to somebody else, then that's an issue right then and there. What does it take for fulfillment? That ultimately becomes the situation and the means to the end of what we're talking about when we deal with purpose. But we have to ask ourselves, what is fulfillment? Because that concept of fulfillment, again, tends to be shaped by the reality that you created or generated for yourself. So when you deal with the concept of fulfillment, all of the other 7 factors have to come into play, because these are the things that shape that concept of fulfillment. And then based upon you having this sense of fulfillment, now you start carrying or conducting yourself out according to what you think purpose tends to be. Does anybody got something they want to add on to this before we move on? I don't like a quiet class. Have something.
That's what happened when you knock it out the park, comrade.
Appreciate you. All right, let me move on then. All right, here go another quote from the 50th law. Understand, people judge you by appearances, the image you project through your actions, words, and styles. If you do not take control of this process, then people will see and define you the way they want you to, often to your detriment. So what 50 Cent is referencing there is basically goes right back to what I'm saying. When we talk about within the Panther Party, defining, developing, and then defending yourself in your way of life, and whether we talk about the individual, family, or the collective and community, the point being, if you are not taking control of that process of defining who you are, of the process of determining your purpose, then others will naturally do it for you. And so whether we talk about this, again, through the trifecta of the individual, the family, or the collective, the same thing takes shape. Either you are figuring this out and operating this from the position of taking accountability to the direction that you want your life to go in, or others are. Someone else is controlling that. So when we talk about purpose as it applies to that, realize that is going to be one of 2 things. And also from that standpoint, let's not get caught up in polarity. There are always various stages in terms of how we operate. We may be doing certain things that we don't necessarily find to be in alignment with our purpose, but at the same time, there may be a benefit to that fulfills the aspect of the purpose that we're moving towards. So don't allow crystallization or things to be hard coded to the point to where you don't have the ability to be fluid in your ability to navigate through the concept of purpose, because purpose is not a singular concept. Next quote here from Robert Greene, based on the 50th law. Your fears are a kind of prison that confines you within a limited range of action. The less you fear, the more power you will have, and the more fully you will live. So let's go into what we talk about here when we deal with how we end up identifying with false purpose. It is intentional that the path of false purpose is easy to follow. Let me say that again. It is intentional that the path of false purpose is easy to follow. This is the illusion needed to cloud defined purpose. Goes back to why we talked about that on point number 1, and is to say we are gaining our freedom. It is a journey. We are gaining our freedom. Whether we talk about this again as the individual, family, or community, we must accept the fact that our life is based upon the journey of gaining a position or a path. Your real purpose will drive you to your true self, while the false comes from external sources. Belief systems are conformity to what other people are doing or want you to do. Now, this again has various degrees of operation. So we can't allow ourselves to be polarized by a concept of operating necessarily within a group or a cycle. It has to do with the fact that how you are defining your purpose, how you are shaping your accountability, and again, dealing with self-determination. Your real purpose will drive you to improve your skills, your mind, to realize your potential and contribute to society. A false purpose appeals to the animal side of our nature. And so we'll start, let's break down what we mean when we say the animal side of nature. The most common forms listed below that lead to falsehood have appealed to humans since the beginning of time. The pursuit of pleasure, or what we call divergent distractions that appeal to our chemical makeup, aka stimulants, sexual desires, entertainment, material consumption. So let's stop real quick here and spend a minute on this. So when we talk about these stimulants, we talk about things that within the body system or the makeup of our anatomy based upon us having the type of consciousness we have. These things entrap us and keep us caught up in wanting more stimulation, more stimulation. And one of the biggest traps within a society, especially when we talk about the American system in terms of the amount of information that we have access to, we get caught up in what's referred to as the information overload or data overload. We got so much access to so much things, to especially as it applies to entertainment. Like for instance, when a person would go to social media, YouTube or something like that, and you end up in this cycle of watching something, and then the next thing you know, you want to watch the next highest level or the next level of drama, or or something that's dramatic and something that's like a horror movie, something like that. For instance, you keep upping the level of stimulants that you need to the point to where you become numb to it, which goes right into the cycle of now not being able to be fulfilled because you based your pursuit of purpose on this entertainment, on this stimulant. So the stimulant itself becomes that driving factor that causes you to define purpose. In other words, you may see yourself caught up in the fact that, well, you are creating an economic cycle for yourself simply so that you can go back and deal with these specific divergent distractions. In other words, the more money I make, the more entertainment I can have exposure to. The more money I make, the more material consumption I can have. The more money I make, the more sexual desires I can fulfill. So everything is built around these stimulants. And the problem with stimulus from that standpoint is that it's going to always increase. And it also patterns itself from that same concept, the same way humanity has patterned imperialism and capitalism. These things have grown up out of these same concepts of pursuits for pleasure. And what they have done is just basically manifested itself in a governmental operation, which leads us to the next one here. Money and success. Money and success are the result of something, but not the end goal. Through imperialism comes the addiction of the perpetual cycle of constant need to keep success going and increase of profit. The reshaping of the concept of success must be transformed. And the reason why I say that, and let's just kind of break that down a little bit, is that what is it that we call success? See, because that couples right back to the concept of purpose. So when we think that we're successful, oftentimes we equate, as individuals, we would equate success with how much money we got. That's what we deem to be equating success with. And again, that's putting yourself in that sphere of material consumption from the standpoint of now you are being defined by how much labor or how much economics can pass through your hands. And when you define yourself based upon that, and those stimulus come into play to where basically I am successful simply because I have access, more access than those around me, so to speak, because it's a measurement concept now, that I am able to, you know, operate and live in this abundance, in this plethora of abundance. And from that standpoint, again, when we talk about divergent distractions, it goes into the fact that the whole point here is to keep you in that perpetual cycle of constantly raising the bar, raising the bar, raising the bar, raising the bar. So you get caught up in that whole cycle here. And then the whole aspect of what money is defined and tied to success. Well, then success is then tied right back down to money. And so you become this beast that is used to keep everything operating on the level of imperialism that's going on. The next one here, attention and fame. Because of the desire to feel more important, you become dependent on the applause and the size of your fan base. Think of the extremes people go to on social media for attention to get likes and shares. Like money and success, there's never enough likes, there's never enough that attention you can't grab. That even goes into the concept of why on social media it's referred to, people refer to themselves as being influencers. So you got to look at it for what it is. It goes back to why we talk about the definitions. If the nature of a YouTube channel or someone establishing a YouTube and is establishing followers is to create influence, then that also goes right back to what we stated earlier. And let me pull that back up. What group of people do I look to for my guidance? And what group of people look to me for guidance? When you talk about an influencer, when you talk about someone that is trapped up in social media from the stance of needing to have these likes, needing to have these followers, needing to have these connections. Same thing with Facebook. Always putting my day-to-day happenings on Facebook. I always got to let you know what I'm doing. I always got to let you know what I'm engaged in. These go right into now defining your purpose. Person go to work and possibly work a job that they don't care about, but it's irrelevant because the bottom line of them is they just want to hurry up and get home and get in front of that computer and jump on Facebook or use your smartphone throughout the day and be on Facebook. What is defining your purpose at this point? Because everything you're doing is geared toward the consumption of getting those likes, of getting that attention. So now you have to look at that as it applies to navigating your life. And for more information on that, I put here for y'all to research the concept of cyber psychology, because it's real important. It's real powerful when you actually study how psychology looks at the entire way life has been reshaped based upon social media. Now, the last one here is groups and causes. Humans have a desire to believe in something, to be a part of something, yet if joined for the wrong reason, from the need to gratify the ego, guilt, or to vent negative emotions, then you're more than likely, obviously, joining for the wrong reason. And if these are your motivations, this is not your calling. Too often we find ourselves associating with a group simply because of, again, a negative response, a negative action, or simply because we have no idea what we want to do, what we believe in, and we tend to follow the group. See, the idea here is that when you join a cause or when you join a group, it should be because you believe and you want to be a part of what that is that's being dealt with and challenged. Within the Panther Party, this is why the first thing we address is the platform. Why? Because these are the basic principles in terms of how we operate and where we are going and what our purpose is as an organization from that standpoint. But if a person is joining simply because, again, they want to be able to say that they're a Panther, or they want to deal with venting negative emotions, or they want to basically simply engage in combat or fight, so to speak, then what is your real calling? What is your real purpose? What does that mean about where you are within yourself? And this is why oftentimes somebody may jump from organization to organization, or or group to group, or even a lot of times go into the aspect of why people tend to be nomadic and do a lot of moving. Because if you tend to look for external things to bring you pleasure, external things to bring you satisfaction, then you're going to be caught in a perpetual cycle of constantly trying to be fulfilled. No one should be joining, especially a movement that has to do with embracing and empowering the people for the sake of being fulfilled, or for the sake, when we say fulfilled, is, in other words, you want to get pats on the backs, or you want to feel like, you know, you're a better person simply because you're a part of this, but not necessarily want to do the work that is necessary for that organization to be that organization. You know, it's one thing to be a part of something simply because you want to say that you're a part of it. It's an entirely different thing to add to the foundation, and what we refer to within the Panther Party as generational foundational advancement, meaning that the goal here is for you to continually advance the output and the growth and the production and the abilities of the people to be able to operate, again, going back to what we said on point number one, to operate from a position of self-determination and to deal with the aspect of defining the destiny of our communities. And so that's fighting, you know, that's directly challenging the aspect of what creates a situation to where you operate from false purpose. So as you go upon your battle in your journey through defining true purpose, the idea now would be connect with others that have that same value system. Now that is obviously a positive way to join it, but that goes against the idea of gratifying the ego. That goes against the idea of having guilt. Guilt, we find oftentimes, is associated directly with fear. Too often, most of us operate, especially through within religious cycles, operate through guilt and fear. We join it simply because if we're not associated with it, then our peer group, our family, may guilt us, which goes into creating that level of fear, which causes you to join it, not because you truly believe in it or truly support it, but simply because this is how you quell the outside fluctuation or the outside noises from, you know, from knocking on your doorstep. And so that obviously will eat away and erode your true value and your true purpose. So let's talk a little bit. Before I go on, is anybody got any questions or something to add to that? Go ahead, Doris. Someone that first person raise their hand.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, as far as the creation of false purpose, because this is just something I've been thinking about for a while now. What role do you think fear of mortality plays in the human need to create false purpose? To what degree do you think, you know, we all know we're gonna die. It's nature to want to survive, so we want to wrap ourselves up in all of these distractions or causes or things that we think might carry on after us in order to distract our minds from the fact that we recognize that we're going to die.
So basically the question is going back to what role does morality play in that?
I'm just kind of wondering, like, what role does that make? To what degree do you think that plays a role in the creation of the false purpose and the need to create false purpose?
Okay, well let me elaborate on that one based upon to me, a real easy one to turn to for that would be oftentimes organized religion. For instance, from the standpoint of is portrayed as to how you live your life in the here and now is going to determine your fate in the hereafter, so to speak. So from that standpoint, right then and there, what you're doing is you're creating a confined lifestyle to the point to where if you operate outside of these parameters, quote unquote, you may go to hell, or quote unquote, you are going to be reborn again to repeat this cycle until you get it right. The problem we find with that is that this tends to have a basis, again, of fear. This tends to cause us to operate within a certain parameters simply because we don't want to be caught in this this fire and brimstone, or this situation of the hereafter that could be way worse than what we've experienced in the physical. And so without actually having any tangible concrete evidence of these quote unquote repercussions, we operate and we define ourselves based upon these values. Now, going back to the high moral code, obviously certain things only make sense. For instance, if you take in society, or you take again, take ourselves as being part of nature, we have to put ourselves back in that cycle, back in that equation as being part of nature. You should only take from your environment what is needed to sustain yourself. But obviously, when we are accustomed to certain pleasures, or we're accustomed to certain constant drives that want to consume more and more and more, now we get caught up into taking way more than what's necessary simply for the sake of that stimulation. Now that stimulation also gets applied to a dollar amount. So once it get applied to a dollar amount, now all of a sudden I find out that I can make money off of the fact that everybody has to have this stimulation. So then it becomes a capital. Now that it becomes a capital, as an individual, now I want to raise the bar, and I'm able to control what the masses of the people based upon their acquired taste and need, quote unquote need, they think they need, their need for this level of consumption. So then that separates me from the group, and now I become part of an elite cycle. So becoming part of that elite cycle, the idea here is to keep the consumption half, or the consumption part of that equation, codependent upon my my giving, or my value, by applying that resource in that access to this. And then when I raise the price of it, that makes it creates this concept or illusion that it's even more valuable. And so now I start chasing after it based upon value. That's like no different than someone tacking a name on a product like a Louis Vuitton, and all of a sudden now it's more valuable simply because of the name. It ain't no more of a purse than any other purse, other than the fact that the name. But again, when we talk about this from the morality aspect, going back to what you were saying, we find ourselves trapped in a fear cycle simply because of the unknown. Oftentimes, as individuals, we will operate in a slave cycle simply because we know what this one is. It's referred to as a lesser of two evils. It's referred to as what we call the devil, because we know what to expect within this specific obstacle. Oftentimes we're more willing to cope with that, which causes us to remain in this negative cycle, causes us remain in this cycle where we're not willing to jump outside of the norm, jump outside of what we see everyone doing, for the sake of the fear of failure. And the fear of failure goes right back into that religious cycle of, if you don't do this, or if you don't operate this way, this is what's going to happen to you in the next life. And so it's so easy to get played upon that aspect of morality. And our fear of death also goes into, again, the unknown. It is a natural process to have what we call fight or flight. But the problem with that is when it is magnified for the sake of manipulating a society, which is what we find ourselves in as a state of people. And this is not just obviously the United States. This is just how you control a society, period, from a governmental standpoint, is you have to create a level of fear. And that level of fear is a form of power. And that form of power is how you rule a society. I think somebody else had their hand up. Go there, Adrian.
Hey, all power. So my question is back to what you were saying about doing things that you don't necessarily agree with is a form of growth and challenging ego. How, I guess, what would you use as a metric to kind of understand, like, if that grading your feeling? Because I was raised to believe like the definition of selling your soul, not in a religious sense, but in a general sense, is doing anything that goes in the opposite direction of like what your soul believes is right, like, you know, what you internally believe as just. So my question is how you can tell when something you disagree with is based in a genuine disagreement with your sense of morality, and when it's just a sense of like resistance to change based in ego.
Okay, that's a real good question. I would start off from that standpoint of you have to, again, this has to do with your sphere of awareness. Let's just start with that. Based upon a person's sphere of awareness, how do you define that or gauge whether or not this is the idea of selling your soul? For instance, let's just use the basic concept a lot of people are able to familiarize themselves with or associate with when you talk about like something within the music industry. Oftentimes someone say, oh, they sold out or they selling their soul, because basically what's happening at this point is that their music is not based upon adding anything of substance to the body of music, but they're simply producing music for the sake of record sales. In other words, I'm going to say whatever is needed to say in order to produce more followers, like we said earlier, or to get more sales, or to create a larger body of people that will continually put money in my pocket, or book me at shows, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about selling your soul as it applies to that, let's just go back to the concept of imperialism. What is being is what you're doing and what you're being involved in simply for the sake of creating that cycle of consumption. So is your drive based upon that consumption? It's one thing to get paid well for doing something that is a specialized industry or specialized talent. It's another thing when you take that specialization and now what you do is you use that to basically manipulate everybody else and keep them from being able to have access to whatever it was that gave you or allowed you to have that insight. Just it's like the difference between somebody being talented and then somebody creating a facade as if it's not talent, but is who you know, or how you project it, or how you promote it, and then engulfing that or encasing that in going back to what we talked about earlier in dealing with the stimulants. Now you want to add sex appeal to it. So when your record sales, so for instance, are based upon sex appeal, then are you really attempting to move people based upon the content, or you moving toward bringing a awareness or a consciousness to the people? When the record or the product that you're producing, so should I say, is purely based on monetary gains, is purely based on basically how much I can acquire by putting out this product, then that's leaning toward obviously selling my soul. So what is the reason for creating that product? Is that product purely about stimulation, or is that product simply using stimulation in order to get the message across? In other words, it's no different than how music can be used to provide a powerful message, because music is a carrier wave or a carrier signal. No different than when you talk about food products or food, should I say, and I'm gonna call them products, because when we start adding things to it, it's no longer a food, it's now a food product. So for instance, when sugar is added as an ingredient, that's simply because sugar creates a certain chemical stimulant that causes you to want or want to consume whatever that sugar is added to. So when my product is based upon the stimulants that is needed for that product to make headway, then I am leaning toward that position of selling my soul. I am leaning toward that position of false purpose, because the purpose itself is basically to consume. The purpose itself is basically to constantly add to the pile. Whereas a true purpose would be about the message itself, would be about the product itself, not so much the packaging of the product, or not so much the consumption of the product, but the product itself. I hope that kind of answered your question. If did I?
For the most part, certainly, it definitely helped clear up the like when you are, like it helped define like when you are selling your soul. I guess my question was more based in when you can tell, like that feeling you get when you hear something or see something or are exposed to something or asked to do something and your gut says this is wrong, right? Like I guess being able to tell when that's legitimately something that you're encountering that is, you know, wrong and immoral, or if you perceive it as wrong as immoral, and that's an opportunity for you to like grow and change. Like if that resistance, if that aversion is based in ego and resistance to growth, or if it's based in a recognition of something that's actually immoral. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that kind of just goes back to your intuition and what we call that higher that high moral code. Now, if it's going against the high moral code, in other words, it's not adding a to the foundation of what's you know what you've created in terms of a value system of righteousness, and a value system of development, or like we would say within the Panther Party, working toward empowerment or empowering the people. If it's not working toward that, and you get that gut feeling or that intuition that this is the wrong path or the wrong way, but you ignore that and you still move on that, now you have to step back and ask yourself, if I am ignoring my intuition, or I'm ignoring my gut feeling, I'm ignoring the fact that logic is telling me that this is not the right way to go about this, or this is not the right path, what am I going to gain by ignoring that? In other words, look further down the path and look toward the repercussion or the consequences of ignoring that, or the consequences of going in that path. See, I tell people all the time, too often when we think about the word consequences, we think about it, you know, purely in a negative sense. Everything, period, has a consequence. For every action or non-action, there is a consequence. And so from that standpoint, the consequences of making a specific move or not making a specific move, there's always something that's going to happen. Everything has a connection. It goes right back to where we started with, when we said everything exists, has a specific nature. Based upon that specific nature of what that is, based upon that specific nature of that move, it's going to determine the consequences or the additional things that coincide with that action or that activity or that direction. So you have to always just keep that in the forefront of, well, what's the next move? What's the next move after that move? So everything, every step that I take, I need to try to think 3 and 4 steps ahead of that. That way you are seeing the ultimate repercussions of consequences based upon those moves that you are making, or based upon the moves that you choose not to make. So for instance, when we talk about people not engaging in community involvement, not caring a damn about who their next door neighbor is, not caring a damn about the trash that is out there on the street, not caring about, you know, what happens outside of their doors, the consequence of not caring, the consequence of not being involved will be the degradation of that community, which will ultimately wind back up at your doorstep, simply because if you're not being a part of the solution, then you're operating as part of the problem from that standpoint. To ignore something from to that degree is not going to solve it, simply because you want to pretend like it's not existing. So to not be involved, there's always consequence. There's consequence to our non-action. When we're not active in fighting against police brutality, when we're not active in addressing the injustice system, then it allows that system to be more perpetual in terms of its influence on the masses of people, which ultimately will work its way back to me. So when I'm not applying my intuition and I'm ignoring clear signs that I'm operating in a capacity or operating on something that really is against my overall path or goal, then there is going to be a consequence. That don't mean necessarily that it at the end is going to be to your demise. It just really depends. That's why the whole point there is really to kind of think steps as far ahead as you can in terms of that specific move that you're making. And that's kind of really the best I can say with that kind of in an ambiguous way of phrasing that. But your intuition is there for a reason, and that's basically to allow you to think about this a little bit deeper, to ask yourself more questions about it, so that you can have more information and more to work with as you navigate that. So I hope that answered that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, so let's move on to now steering clear of false purpose. If you look around yourself, you'll see that most people fall in the same dream, so much so that they all seem to have the same purpose. The most common example is how everyone believes their purpose in life is to earn money, going back to what we talked about earlier. In addition to that, starting a family also accompanies this desire to acquire wealth. This will sound very familiar to most people only because these are the words of your parents, teachers, or friends. You've always heard people talk about these basic things. They're repeated so often that it seems like these things are the sole purpose of humanity. But think about your role, the role you had in determining these purposes for yourself. Were you ever consulted in establishing these goals, or are they mere echoes of others telling you what your goals should be? See, that kind of coincides with the idea here of how a society can shape itself for the sake of moving in that mechanical direction of what's reviewed as progress. And progress, best, especially when we talk about imperialism to that degree, is based upon a profit, always having a profit, always being able to turn a larger profit, always being able to conquer new domains, suck up more, smaller businesses, so to speak, and create conglomerates. And so from that standpoint, it seems like when more things are connecting that way, that it is having more of a purpose. What it's doing is having more of a connection to creating a power or an empire from that standpoint. And so we have to be real careful about the difference between connecting for the sake of moving things progressively forward, and the difference between that and consumption, because progression is not always defined by the amount of takeover or the amount of things that you can put under your belt or consume or bring into your fold. So when we talk about steering away from false purpose, the biggest aspect of a lot of times is, should I say, the easiest one to utilize is the end game about earning more money. And is it all based around how much money you can earn? So let's keep going on that here. So chances are that somewhere along the line, others did the deciding to determine this for you. Your elders, mentor, coaches, and teachers took it upon themselves to decide for you without including you in the decision-making process. So what you thought was a choice was nothing more than a suggestion or a conditioned message letting you believe that you were the one making the choices, also called subliminal intrusive thought. Now, one thing I do want to say is, obviously, when we're dealing with a child and a child being guided to not make certain mistakes, like, for instance, don't touch the stove because it's hot, things like that, it only makes sense that there are parameters. This kind of goes right back to that actually applies to a code than it does a morality. So the concept of a code from that standpoint, there only makes sense that there's only it only makes sense that certain codes again will be what we call high codes or serve this test of time. If you touch fire, you know you're gonna get burnt. That only makes sense to be a code. But when you couple the concept of the code with morality, and then you define that morality based upon a certain culture or lifestyle that conflicts with other moralities, and that your code is above all other people's codes, now you start getting into that aspect to where you're dealing with power and you're dealing with control and you're dealing with a purpose that is going to be the demise of others. And now what we mean by subliminal and intrusive thought injection, that's an important concept that we're talking there, is it goes into the fact that oftentimes, especially as we get older, we may not necessarily recognize the difference between our thought and a thought that's been implanted in us. When we see things over and over and over again, that's referred to as subliminal intrusive thought, simply because all of a sudden we find ourselves liking something because of the amount of exposure we've had to the same thing. It's no different than kind of going back to the music example of hearing a song on the radio that you know you don't like, you know it don't make sense that you even would listen to that song, but because you keep getting in a situation to where you hear it, next thing you know, you start humming, and next thing you know, you start liking it. Next thing you know, here you are being in favor of hearing that song that you know it in the back of your mind is a stupid song to listen to, doesn't bring any value to you, and is negative in terms of what it is providing. But because of that subliminal intrusive thought injection as a technique of manipulation, now you are associating that with what you like. So in other words, this has become part of your makeup as that thing that you should have avoided, going back to kind of the question that was just asked earlier, or based on our intuition, has now embodied us. This is going to impair our ability to critical think on other subject matters, because we went against our principle, we went against our moral code, we went against what makes us operate in a higher capacity, or in a more righteous self-aware capacity. In one category, it will impede and start affecting other areas as well. So it can tend to be a cascading effect. And so we have to be able to isolate ourselves from that.
Question.
Go ahead, Chief.
Do you think this same concept can be used as a tactic for steering people in the right direction?
Well, yes, it can. And again, when we start talking about the reason why we address point number one on the platform by saying that we embrace the spiritual high moral code of our ancestors, we started off this whole discussion by talking about a high moral code. So yes, it can. The problem becomes when we are not able to see, in other words, have the same level of exposure. Going back to that song example, when we're not able to have the same level of exposure of something progressive that is constantly impeding us on a negative capacity, then what happens is the negative one would have way more influence than the positive one, even though if a person takes a step back and look at it from their rational mind, they'll be able to, a logical mind, they'll be able to say, well, obviously this is in my best interest. Obviously this is something negative. But because of us being addicted to stimulation, we find ourselves not capable of overcoming this addiction, overcoming the urge and the desires. And see, those desires go back to what we call reshaping the appetite. And so unless we reshape our appetite for the action, or for the certain things that we want to bring into our life, then we'll find ourselves constantly at war and battling whether or not we're gonna expose ourselves to this, or whether or not we're gonna do that. So it's like
Right on.
someone that's caught up into substance abuse. I know that it's bad for me, but at the same time, because of that chemical imbalance, because this particular substance was created and the ingredients of it was literally meant to attack my ability to not want it anymore. You know, going back to the example of sugar, then now we're dealing with this fight of our willpower. Now, and that's easy to think about that from the example of a physical a substance. But keep in mind now when we talk about a holistic human being, whether we talk about this physically, mentally, or spiritually, it's the same thing. What creates those spiritual addictions and those spiritual stimulants? What creates those mental stimulants and addictions, as well as the physical ones? Because all those play into effect and cause us to get off base and lose the sight or the ability to even pursue our true purpose. So everything has its place and play into it. So one thing I do want to say just on that same note, this is why it's important, I would say and I didn't necessarily reference it in this document, but this is why it's important for us to look at projects like MK Ultra, because basically what they did in that project is they utilized ways to manipulate a people and studied how the mind and the brain would operate in terms of stimulants that will cause people to be able to fall up under certain types of programming or certain types of operation, even though their logical mind would say this doesn't make any sense. So the whole point of the experiment was to figure out the ways to manipulate individuals, collective groups, and the masses to think and operate a certain way, even though if they take a step back from it, they'll recognize that it's a detriment to their lifestyle.
Right on. I guess, yeah. So I feel like, you know, as organizers, it wouldn't be a responsibility to increase the exposure to the right thing.
Yep. That's the key is to work on that exposure.
Right on. I think about this subject a lot, you know, and you know, some of us, you know, may feel like, I don't know, maybe we just don't know enough sometimes, or like to step into certain things, or, you know, are just still so inundated in these things that we use our creative energies and still without even really sitting down and look at it, you know, for saving that energy for the social media, saving that energy for other things. When I think about, you know, 66 or like, you know, 1991, even, you know, when people walk around with kufis and Malcolm X tees, and you know, what created that desire, you know, to step in the right direction. And I think a big part of it was simply exposure, you know, as to what was going around them, you know. So like going past that, I guess my next question would be, you know, how to maintain that level of exposure as we see, you know, those things either die down or get co-opted by some kind of mainstream thing, and then like turn into something completely different that's 10 times as destructive as the last thing.
I would say when it comes to that, this goes back to why I emphasize to Panthers and people that are coming into the movement that you have to be students of psychology. And I say that going right back into the example that I gave about MK Ultra. When you study the techniques that have been used against us as a people, you have to recognize the reason why these techniques have been successful. And so knowing that, we have to be able to be, again, students of psychology to the point to where we understand what makes a person tick. We understand what creates appetites. We understand what drives appetites. We understand what causes stimulation, and the fact that most of us, for the most part, because of our upbringing, because of the amount of candy we've been fed throughout our lives, going back to stuff like Halloween and exposure to holidays, and how holidays are co-opted to basically create this environment to where we go out and spend. Now, all of these things have become part of our conscious day-to-day being. And so even when we attempt to try to escape it, society tries to pull us back into it. So we're constantly fighting against a system that is designed to keep you in consumption mode. So the more exposure that we're able to bring through the awareness of psychology in terms of exposing people to the fact that this is what's being done to you, as people become aware of the cycles that they're going through, then our ability to be able to impact and bring more people on board grows. And so from that standpoint, as people define and recognize the difference between false purpose and true purpose, and we implement that reproductive cycle, going back to that element, and work on what we call a foundational generational advancement, then we start shaping ourselves to be able to be a greater force. So it basically goes right back to saying that we have to hold ourselves accountable to our destiny, and we have to recognize as a purpose that becomes your driving force. As that becomes your driving force, then you don't need to be motivated to do the work that you need to do for the people. And so therefore, by not needing that motivation of stimulation in order to do this work, you are able to cross over that barrier to where you have to have a specific appetite in order to be attracted to this. And so again, going back to people that are being influenced, as people see that you are still in your right mind, you're not mentally distraught, you're able to be happy, you're able to be fulfilled, and also be an organizer, also be working with the people and doing things other than always tying something back to self, what I call self pleasures. Then other people will latch on to that other side, because again, we fear what we don't know. But when we're able to expose people to what they thought was unknown, and they're able to see at the other side is not as bad as they thought it was, or that it's not even as bad as at all, that they've been tricked into thinking that it's bad, been tricked into thinking that being in control of your own destiny, or dealing with self-sufficiency is a bad thing. Then as people get that exposure and that awareness and come up out of that, now we're able to again start gaining more ground. And then you also got to look at the inedible fact that one of the things I definitely throw at people all the time is the longer humanity lives outside of nature in terms of being out of balance with it, the more destruction will be done to the planet. And the more destruction will be done to the planet, the more that it will inevitably reverse itself and create a situation where it has to eradicate itself of that disease, that virus, that thing that is taking it out of balance. So nature has a way of bringing things back into balance. So as humans, we have to decide what side of nature do we want to be on. Do we want to remain on the side that is going to eradicate our ability to cohabitate on this planet, or do we want to be on the side to where our future generations will have the ability to be able to enjoy or have access to the same level of things that we've had? And so if nothing else, as we bring that level of exposure to the people, then they will start holding themselves at least a little bit more accountable and get into that pattern of being more accountable and more aware and more positive and more empowering for the collective as it applies to the human race, which goes against, and works to destroy the imperialistic mentality and concept.
Right on. That was perfect. Thank you.
All right, let me move on here. Recognizing false purpose. It's kind of just a continuation here. Many life coaches talk about how finding your purpose isn't related to money or career. And we got to keep going back into that. It's about finding your true self. This is the self that you've hidden beneath the needs of people around you. It's quite true that you tend to hide your real purpose underneath people's needs. The society needs you to be busy 9-to-5 person. So you hide the carefree artist inside you. Your parents need you to get a good degree. And so from that standpoint, what we're talking about is we're talking about the fact that the previous generations them being caught up in that same cycle, especially when we talk about the 9 to 5, the same cycle of what works against us having a progressive purpose. These kind of things cause us to hide our true selves from the world. And as we hide our true selves from the world, then we end up hiding our true selves from ourselves. And the older we get, the more this gets suppressed. And as this gets suppressed, it becomes something that you tend to not have access to at a certain point in your life, especially from the standpoint of being able to exercise it. So the way one expresses themselves and the choices that are made can be summed up into one word: identity. Whether we are born with our identity or we form it as we grow, one's culture, choices, and opinions of themselves is identity. One question that many people ask is whether they were born with our identity, or if or if we can choose our own identity. This is referred to as the born identity replacement. The effect of copying out surrounding patterns and equating this with your birth marker. As we come into self-consciousness by moving beyond the emulation during our adolescent stage of child development, this becomes a critical period as our emotional body turns in our drive for to form independence. As our environmental dangers set course to steer us, we take on a mold. This process of molding will either yield liberation, or we become victims of the mold and become part of the molding as a transplanter. Transplantation means to transition to a plantation. Let me say that again. Transplantation means to transition to a plantation. This is the joining of the greater labor and the conditioning through habitual patterns in our will to have this embedded as a norm. I apologize, y'all. I was brainstorming when I was writing all this. For more insight into this, check out the document "Silent Weapons Required War." So let me talk a little bit more on what I meant when I said born identity, because a lot of people may not necessarily may have heard that word as it referred to a movie, but might not have known that as it applies to dealing with the concept of purpose. And I want to even go back to the movie series of Born Identity when we talk about this, just so y'all can have a deeper insight into what was actually being talked about and done within that movie. The Born Identity, and the guy that played it was referred to as Jason Bourne. See, this is still a play on words and a play on consciousness and the concept. The idea is that he didn't know who he was, but what he had was special abilities that allowed him to be able to be a powerful killer. And so that made him a threat. And since that made him a threat to society because of who he was, the last thing they wanted Jason Bourne to do was to be able to fully come to grips with his identity. So I don't know how many of y'all picked up on that being the undergird of the entire concept. So the point was to create what was referred to as a born identity replacement. And to create a born identity replacement is to basically suppress the natural abilities and the natural movement that a person may have that guides them naturally toward the course of a productive or a positive purpose. So creating a born identity replacement is to provide them with something that suppresses that ability to recognize a direction that they need to be headed in. And so once you replace that, then that becomes your makeup. And as that becomes your makeup, after a certain period of time, you no longer have direct access to that. And so therefore, when something seeps up in you and you start thinking, well, this naturally feels good, or I'm naturally able to move this way, or I'm naturally more inclined to operate like this, you get pulled back out, and everything within society comes at you and attacks you. Going back to that movie, attacks you and causes you to have to utilize more of your natural abilities in order to overcome that. But at the same time, you're always working against everything that's around you, because everything that's around you is based upon that replacement. And so one of the most powerful documents I've read that really gets into the nature of realizing this as a way of construct that the masses are caught up in is a document called Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. Do I got any questions? Or anybody have a comment to make about this? Because this is a very key, essential part of what we're talking about. Really, that's the meat of it when it comes down to it, is that what we fall under is the born identity replacement. All right, I keep moving. So this takes us to point number 5 on the platform. We employ education for our people that exposes the true nature of this devilish and decadent American society. We provide an education that teaches us our true legacy and our role in the present day society. We operate from an educational system that gives our people a knowledge of self. And see, that's the key point there. An educational system that gives our people a knowledge of self. Having direct knowledge of self, our position in society and the world develops our proper relationship with everything else. So going back to purpose, and even going back to what was stated earlier, or a question that was asked earlier about dealing with intuition and dealing with this gut feeling that something is not right or moving in the right direction. When we say here, having direct knowledge of self, our position in society and the world develops our proper relationship to everything else. So the more in tune we are with self, the more in tune we become with nature. In other words, we start automatically living out a harmonious relationship and in harmony with everything that is going on around you, which causes you to have less pearls or less situations of negative cycles or negative things that impede your life. But again, mind you, a lot of this feeds right back into your appetite, because if you have an appetite that causes you to constantly consume things, there are consequences for that. Regardless of how good of a person you find yourself to be, if you are doing things that are out of balance with what's going on with what your body needs, what your mental needs, and what your spiritual needs, there is going to be a degradation effect that goes along with that. And that's why we started off with the word entropy and talks about the natural progress of something being in a state of decline, because that's going to be a natural byproduct of us operating outside of our true self, whether we want to accept it or not. So understand that it's not based upon mere intention, is because, you know, people have people all around the world, you know, even those people that that are in elite positions oftentimes may have a quote unquote good intention, but it's not about your intention, because intentions don't mean a damn thing when it comes to what's real and what's going to, when it actually is going to happen based upon certain types of moves that are being made. It's not about the intent, it's about what's really being done. So that goes into why you need to steer clear of false purpose. In the beginning, it may seem like you're doing things right. Again, going back to the intention. Then you look around, look around you, and comfort yourself by saying that everyone else is doing the same thing too. Yet deep inside, you lack both contentment and happiness. Then you have an empathy. A time when everything comes crashing down, you realize you are just like everyone else, or you are just like others. And so what I'm basically saying from that standpoint is, it's like seeing yourself in the matrix and then feeling like, well, because I'm in the matrix or I'm doing what everybody else is doing, then it must be the right thing to do. But then you take a step back and you recognize that, wait a minute, I am doing what everybody else is doing. And you start having that actual burst of consciousness in terms of recognizing that it is exactly the whole point of a false purpose. That is exactly how you have been trapped in the first place. So now that you have an idea what false purpose is, going back to born identity replacement, You need to steer clear of it. Your false purpose can destroy you. And at some point in your life, maybe 10 to 20 years from now, you'll regret not only the illusion purpose, but also the time you spent aiming for it. If you run after a false purpose, you'll realize it sooner or later. But will you then be past the event horizon of your willpower to make change and commit to true purpose? Let me break that down. Because when we talk about realizing something way later, then that goes into the aspect again of what we call the event horizon from that standpoint, which basically means a point of no return. And we'll address that here on the next statement. But the thing about that is the whole aim of this is to get you caught up in a repetitive cycle, going back to habitual pattern here, to the point to where it makes no sense, no logical sense for you, because you're measuring things upon your physical age for you to now all of a sudden shift and go into a new direction. So then you're dealing with the element of fear again, because the element of fear is going to tell you that it's too late to make a change. It's too late to do something else, that you might as well just continue with the same path. So we refer to that as an event horizon of your willpower. I got you, Bunchy. Let me keep going here. We almost wrapped up anyway. This point of no return mentality is what happens to most people and tends to be the driving force behind mental crystallization. Knowing how to tell yourself to accept change and allow a process of internal growth is the hardest personal fight you can have. Again, dealing with that point of no return mentality and the crystallization of it is what is basically the part of this whole process that society, or should I say the elite from that standpoint, utilizes to our advantage. So basically time becomes a very powerful enemy against us. And because of the aging process, and because how we view aging, which even ties right back into that question earlier about about our mortality, in terms of knowing that death is near, or the fear of death, and so on and so forth. That process in itself is what drives us to stay within this position of the point of no return, because again, we are comparing things based upon the amount of time that we put into a specific process. It doesn't matter whether or not this process has been wrong all of this time. We're just basing our next move on the amount of time we've already consumed, of already given toward this direction that we're heading. So if we given 40 years of our life for the wrong thing, simply because we feel like we don't have another 40 years to give, then we're going to continue and try to make the best of that path. You see, and so that crystallization that causes us to think that way is what constantly keeps getting repeated from cycle to cycle to cycle. Because now at this point, what are you showing those people within that group that you felt like you didn't have an influence over? Which goes back to why we said those people that we that seek guidance in us. Because if I'm at that point of no return mentality in terms of my crystallization, those around me who may look up to me, even though I don't recognize that they're looking up to me, have that same mentality. And maybe they're thinking about, breaking away or breaking free, but simply because you won't, and you won't express that you won't, because of the fear of not committing yourself to something that you know to be the right thing to do, then it causes other people to do the same thing. And then that goes back to what Chief Quran talked about when we talk about the amount of exposure that a person may have, or a group may have, to something that can be more positive. So we have to be able to recognize that this point of no return is a one of the most powerful variables that cause us to stay on that same path of self-destruction, which goes back to what Huey will refer to when you talk about the difference between revolutionary suicide and reactionary suicide. So most people operate through that reactionary perspective and point of view. So being able to see real separation from the you in terms of what makes you special to the greater plan of parts versus the whole, which why we go back to the concept of the entire ecosystem, or the concept of being in balance with nature. Because now again, the idea of creating this false identity, or that born identity replacement, has to do with making a person think that their part is greater or has more value than in the entire whole. So from that standpoint, you're now fighting against the natural law. You're fighting against what is meant, what will keep the planet in balance, or what can keep a society in balance. So if you steer clear of such false purposes, only then will you find meaning in your life. To do so, you have to learn what it means to listen to yourself. And so saying that, what is your being saying to you? So in other words, it goes back to, that's why I think that document I referenced to Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars is so important, because basically when you talk about being able to listen to yourself, again, there's so much noise going on, and there's been so much exposure to things outside of self. Most of us don't know how to separate ourself from the influences and from the subliminal intrusive thoughts that have interjected into us, and to make us like or have an appetite for certain things. And so from that standpoint, you have to be able to create some form of isolation so that you can learn to define what yourself is, and what your being really is. So also, when you steer clear of false purpose, you do everything fearlessly. This goes back to being able to defeat the concept of fear, which is why I kept referring back to the 50th law, and why I think that's a very powerful book on that standpoint. When you're forced into false purpose, it is often due to fear. The fear of your parents, or the fear of being rejected by society. However, when you find your true purpose, you will do it with love. There is no fear of letting anyone down. You know you're doing this for yourself. And so from that standpoint, it takes you away from that grip that has you, that causes you to operate on that level. Any questions or comments before we move on? All right, let me keep going here. So how can you steer clear of false purpose? If you want to steer clear of false purpose, you need to listen to yourself only. And this is, again, has to do, when we say listen to yourself only, you have to be able to recognize what yourself is, and the importance of that. And so that goes back into when we talked about within the platform, knowing thyself. Ignore what everyone else has to say. Spend time with yourself and learn about yourself. That's the whole point of that. You'll find what drives you. If you care enough for yourself, again, you have to care enough for self. The most important thing is to not be fearful. And that's the key there. Don't fear failure, but be ready to face it. Don't fear rejection, but have the guts to face it. People might tell you that you have disappointed them, but it doesn't matter. You might be wondering, how do I know I am not pursuing a false purpose? The best way to find this is by seeing if what you're doing makes you feel fulfilled and generate empowerment / enlightenment that can be transferable. Again, the key there, and we talked about this earlier, when you talk about fulfillment, what creates that concept of fulfillment? That's why you have to break down the 8 different things we talked about, the different aspects of basically what creates you, which is how you are starting to be able to check off whether or not you're dealing with a false purpose or not. But in doing so, when you talk about being fulfilled, it has to be able to generate empowerment and enlightenment that can be transferable, instead of something that's selfishly contained and stuck within you. If you view everything through the lenses of fear, then you would tend to stay in retreat mode. You can just as easily see a crisis or problem as a challenge, an opportunity to prove your mantle, the chance to strengthen and toughen yourself, or to call to a collective action. By seeing it as a challenge, you will have converted this negative into a positive purely by a mental process that will result in a positive action as well. And that's another quote here from Robert Greene, The 50th Law. So if you're following your true purpose, you'll feel inspired by it every day. You'll find new things in it to love and do every day. To steer clear of flawed purpose, you'll need to define your purpose. So we go back to ending this based upon the same way we started it. The idea here is to be able to recognize what it means to define your purpose. If you have defined your purpose well in advance, you won't have any regrets later. So in closing with that, the whole point is the sooner you're able to recognize and define your purpose, going back to again the Panther Party when we deal with our 3Ds, which is define, develop, and defend, as you apply those and you move those into action, the sooner you move those into action, the more you apply that across the board of spectrum of everything that you involve yourself in, then you will naturally be operating on true purpose. So defining your purpose will give you a clear indication about your next move and allow you more ability to navigate and predict the moves of those that are consumed in false purpose. Having this awareness will ensure that you aren't going toward the pursuit of false purpose. So in addressing that, as we close out, basically, the more that a person has the ability to recognize true purpose, it also gives you the same ability to recognize others as they're operating within that false purpose. Because from that standpoint, operating within that monkey mind and that collective unconsciousness, then you're able to literally see and have predictive patterns in terms of what's going to happen next. And that's just you know really just what we call points in history, or identical markers that we deal with within the history period that we can recognize based upon a society. And if I didn't get a chance, I didn't say it earlier, I meant to, I apologize, but if you want a copy of this document, just go ahead and leave your email in the chat. I give everyone an opportunity to do that. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we close out? Last page is just a few references that that talk more on what we talked about. And also, I do want to end it in saying here, this I thought was a very powerful book, The Handbook for Raising Black Children by Dr. Africa. And I think that's a super powerful book that I don't think gets hardly any attention in the current generation, and it should, because he really breaks things down based upon different developmental stages of the child going into adulthood. And as he breaks those things down and he starts talking about things from the mental, physical, and spiritual capacity, what you find is we really start seeing how as adults we end up with a lot of the negative influences or the negative perceptions or the negative paths that we take on. So by being able to go back and look at how, you know, these different stages are what they are and how they should be handled, even as adults, it can help us go back and bring forward our emotional and psychological and mental body back into the same age bracket of our physical body. So there should never be a point in time to where you are actually at this quote unquote event horizon or point of no return, because as long as we are living, then there's always an opportunity for you to advance and become a better you. And so from that standpoint, your purpose should always be about you. You're not defining your purpose for the sake of others. You're defining your purpose for the sake of you. You're defining your purpose for the sake of bringing humanity back into balance with nature. So with that being said, Any questions or comments before we close out? I see, how do we integrate psychology into our teaching of the people? Basically, let me answer that, and then I go to you, Nick. When we talk about integrating that, again, that's why we within our Panther training, one of the things that we study is neurolinguistic programming. By studying neurolinguistic programming, by studying and being able to identify body language, what we're able to do is we're able to recognize where a person's at and where their weaknesses may be, or should I say, what angles you can come into in order to provide them with information. This even goes back to what Chief Karan was asking about. Can these things be used to benefit the people? And yes, it can. Unfortunately, when we talk about human psychology and in the human condition, because we've been tricked to be outside of self, oftentimes that means we need to be tricked to come back into knowledge of self. So that's a process that has to actually take place. And so from that standpoint, unfortunately, the same things that have led us to not be in tune with who we are and what we are, when we are, where we are, have to be reversed and utilized as a ability to gain us the freedom and the liberation that we should be at. And so from that standpoint, psychology as it applies to that has to be gauged and used from the position of reaching each and every person as it applies to that. So when you take a person and you see whether they learn through audio or visual, touch, or feeling, so to speak, then you have to gauge that conversation around that. And so that's the best way I say to go about those situations. And it's just always a good method to do that. But you have to know who your audience is, and you have to know what strikes them. And so that's the whole point, is to work on touching on the different things that will create that level of attraction. Nick, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I guess I'm thinking, like, when we talked a lot about, like, we have to define our purpose, our correct purpose for ourselves, and then identify false purpose for ourselves. When looking at, like, how do you think we also, because we can't, I guess, we don't know anyone else's true purpose, like, fully. How do we help them identify when you see, like, a false path, or them taking maybe, like you were talking about, mental crystallization in a false direction? How can you encourage others to start looking for their true purpose if they're sort of crystallized in a different mindset?
I would say you start by, basically, this is a good way to go into that. Well, for instance, what formed the relationship, or what formed them reaching out to you? So for instance, if I came to you simply because I just say I know you're a Panther, hey, I admire what y'all doing, I like what y'all doing in the community. How can I be more involved, or how can I find myself, being able to contribute to something? That quest, or that thirst right there for wanting something greater, or wanting to make a change, is the first step. As you deal with that first step, now you have to ask that person, and this goes even to what we deal with within our recruitment training. Well, what are your expectations of joining a party, or what are your expectations of being involved in community activism? And when you ask a person what are their expectations, now you start being able to find out, not only when you say your expectations, when you find out by asking that, going back to psychology, they're going to typically tell you about themselves. They're going to tell you the type of things that make them feel fulfilled based upon the things that they are projecting on society in terms of what it's going to do to be a better society. It also tells you the awareness level, or should I say the spirit or the scope at which they operate from. Because quite often, a lot of times people may have a real basic, super basic aspect of what it means to empower, or what it means to raise the consciousness of the people. And then by being able to see and dissect how little or how much they're thinking outside of the box, you can use that and start working your way to their path of self-discovery, because there's certain things that we all share as it applies to operating on false paths. And what that is, again, going back to when we talked about the born identity replacement, is that there are certain things that most people are just simply caught up in when it comes to consumerism. Give you an example, how we react and respond to holidays, and how we react and respond to feeling the need to be able to have an important role in somebody's life. For instance, I just give you a real simple basic one that goes into a lot of habitual patterns that we play. When somebody sneezes, most people will say, bless you. They're not saying bless you for any other reason other than the fact that they've been told to say that and they've been taught to say that. But if you break down where that came from, and it had to do with the fact that in the Middle Ages, when someone sneezed and they felt like, and it was identified that the heart stopped beating for a quick second, so to speak, then that means you died or you were about to die. So then they want to say bless you in order the fact that you overcame that second, that moment with death, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever in modern day society. But because this phrase has been repeated over and over through generation to generation, we find ourselves saying it. And then if someone sneezes in your presence and you don't say bless you, because you know good and well that just because their heart stopped for a second in order to get a sneeze out, that they're not going to die, now all of a sudden they find offense to the fact that you didn't say bless you. So here we are trapped in our preconceived concepts that don't have any actual merit in today's recognition of science, in today's recognition of where we are as a people. But yet, because of you not following that tradition, you are perceived to be offensive because you didn't say bless you. You perceive to be offensive because you're not following those traditions. This helps you to find out where a person's is from that standpoint in terms of their awareness. So it's little things like that that we have to study and be able to use as I call icebreakers to be able to help people down a certain path of awareness. Because the more we are aware of a lot of the things that we do out of non-valid tradition or non-valid interactions with one another as a society, the more we are able to liberate each other, and the more we can see the same connections of false purpose that we all find ourselves traveling down. So I hope that helped, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. That was wonderful. Thanks.
Anybody else before we close out? All right, again, I appreciate everybody, and let's just keep this moving, and you know, learning to work with what we have, and learning to identify ourselves and our true purpose, and move forward as a collective for the sake of humanity and for the sake of the planet. All power to the people.